The rain in Oregon doesn't just fall. It settles into your bones like a debt you can't pay off. I sat in my old Ford F-150, the engine idling with a rhythmic rattle that matched the drumming on the roof. In my lap sat Jessica's e-reader. The screen was a spider web of shattered glass, a jagged map of the night my life ended. Most folks look at a broken piece of tech and see a trip to the landfill, but to me, this was the last thing my wife ever touched. Her fingerprints were likely still etched into the bezel, invisible under the grime. 2 months. That's how long the farmhouse had been silent. 2 months since I found her on the kitchen floor, her hands still clutching this device as if it were a life preserver. My children, God love them, or so I thought, told me to let it go. They said I was obsessing, that I should just buy the latest model and download her library. But they didn't see what I saw in her final moments. She wasn't just holding it, she was protecting it. I wiped a fogged-up patch on the windshield and looked at the neon sign flickering across the street. Corbin's Tech Repair. I didn't want to go to a big-box store. I needed a ghost hunter. Someone who understood that sometimes data is the only thing a person leaves behind. Stepping out of the truck, the November air hit me like a slap. I'm 70 years old. A retired hazelnut farmer with hands that have more calluses than skin. But walking into that shop, I felt like a schoolboy heading to the principal's office. The air inside smelled of burnt solder and ozone, that sharp, metallic scent that usually makes my skin crawl. Corbin was a young man, maybe 30, with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous twitch in his left eye. He took the e-reader from me like it was a holy relic. I told him I just wanted the screen fixed so I could finish the historical novels Jessica loved. It was a lie. A comfortable one that felt better than saying I was a grieving old man looking for a sign from the grave. "I'll see what I can do, Mr. Garrison," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of a dozen cooling fans. But this impact, it didn't just fall. It looks like it was crushed. "She collapsed," I said, my voice cracking. "It must have hit the counter on the way down." He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He told me to come back in 4 hours. I spent those 4 hours wandering through a Portland drizzle, drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid and staring at families in the park. I didn't know it yet, but those were the last 4 hours of my life as a man who believed in the sanctity of blood. When I returned, the shop's open sign was off, even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. I knocked on the glass. Corbin appeared, his face pale, looking like he'd seen a specter. He didn't just open the door, he yanked me inside and turned the deadbolt. The click of that lock sounded like a guillotine dropping. "Sir," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the street, "you shouldn't let anyone else see what's inside this device." My heart hammered against my ribs. A dull, thudding rhythm. "What are you talking about? It's just books. Dickens, some biographies." "No," Corbin interrupted, leaning over the counter. "The e-book partitions were a shell. I had to bypass a localized encryption just to get the display to initialize. Someone buried high bitrate audio files in the system logs, disguised as firmware update Bonfai Hai Mui. But they aren't updates." He beckoned me into the back room, a cramped space overflowing with motherboard guts and discarded monitors. He sat me down in front of a terminal. He plugged the e-reader in, and a series of waveforms appeared on the screen, jagged lines that looked like a heartbeat. "These are time-stamped," Corbin said. "Every single one of them is from the last week of your wife's life." He hovered his finger over the play button. My breath hitched. I could smell the lavender soap Jessica used to buy, a phantom scent triggered by the sheer terror of what was coming. He pressed play. There was static at first, the sound of fabric rubbing against a microphone. Then a voice. Her voice. It wasn't the weak, fading whisper of the woman I'd watched die. It was sharp, clinical, and terrified. "Thane," she said, and my name sounded like a prayer and a warning. "If you are hearing this, the blue ones aren't mine. I have to hide the real medicine because someone is swapping my bottles." The air left my lungs. The room felt like it was spinning. My wife had Parkinson's, or so the doctors told me. She had tremors, bouts of confusion, and eventually, the stroke that took her. I found them in the spice rack. The recording continued, Jessica's breath hitching. "Silas thinks I'm too far gone to notice. He thinks the shakes mean I'm not looking. But I saw him, Thane. I saw our son in the kitchen at Ba AM with a mortar and pestle. He's grinding them down. He's putting something else in the capsules." Corbin hit the stop button. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. I stared at the screen, at those jagged blue lines, realizing that the stroke wasn't an act of God. It was a calculated murder. "There's more," Corbin whispered. "Hours of it." She was documenting everything. It wasn't just the pills. She recorded conversations through the walls. She knew they were coming for the land. I managed to choke out. "Your son, Silas," Corbin said, looking down at his notes. "And a woman. She calls her Leonie. They talk about fracking rights and state auctions. They talk about you, Mr. Garrison. They call you the obstacle." I felt a surge of cold adrenaline. My son, Silas. The boy I'd taught to hunt, to harvest, to be a man of his word. He was 45 now, a consultant who always smelled of expensive cologne and desperation. I thought he was visiting more often lately out of love. I thought he was helping with the farm because he cared. "Can you put this on a drive?" I asked, my hands trembling so hard I had to grip the edge of the workbench. "Already did," Corbin said, sliding a silver USB stick across the table. He didn't ask for payment. He looked at me with a pity that burned worse than the betrayal. He warned me, "Mr. Garrison, don't go home and confront him. If they did this to her, imagine what they'll do to a 70-year-old man who's suddenly confused about his estate." I tucked the drive and the e-reader into the inner pocket of my wool coat. I walked out into the rain, but I didn't feel the cold anymore. I felt like a man made of stone. The drive home to the Willamette Valley took an hour, but it felt like a century. Every hazelnut tree I passed, every row of soil I'd tended for 40 years, felt like it was morning. As I pulled into the long gravel driveway of the Garrison farm, the headlights cut through the mist, illuminating the porch. My heart stopped. A black luxury SUV was parked in my spot. Silas was standing on the porch, leaning against the railing, checking his gold watch. Beside him was Leon Ross, his business associate with the frozen face and the eyes of a shark. They were smiling. They had a bag of groceries and a bottle of wine. I killed the engine, but I didn't get out. I reached into my pocket and felt the jagged screen of the e-reader. I realized then that I was the only thing standing between them and the soil they wanted to poison. I practiced my confused face in the rearview mirror. I let my jaw slacken just a bit. I made my eyes look watery and unfocused. If they wanted an old man who was losing his mind, I would give them a performance that would earn a standing ovation in hell. I stepped out of the truck, purposely stumbling a little on the gravel. "Dad," Silas called out, his voice dripping with that saccharine, fake concern that I'd been blind to for months. "Where have you been? We were worried sick. You forgot we were coming for dinner again, didn't you?" I went for a drive, Silas," I said, my voice thin and cracking. "I think I got turned around near the old mill. The rain, it makes everything look different." Leon stepped forward, her heels clicking on the wood like a countdown. She reached out and patted my arm. Her touch felt like a snakeskin. "It's okay, Thane. We're here now. We'll take care of everything. Why don't you head inside? I'll make you some of that special tea Silas brought." I looked at the kitchen window. The light was on. It looked warm and inviting, the home I'd shared with Jessica for 42 years. But I knew that inside those walls, the air was toxic. "Tea," I mumbled. That sounds real nice, Leon." As I walked past them, Silas leaned in to whisper to her. I have a hearing aid, a high-end one Silas himself had bought for me, likely to monitor how much I could actually hear. But he didn't know I'd turned the sensitivity up to the maximum. "He's fading fast," Silas whispered, a note of greedy triumph in his voice. "Another week, and he won't even remember his own name." Then we signed the papers. I kept walking, my boots heavy on the floorboards. I went straight to the kitchen. I saw the teapot on the stove, and next to it, a small blue pill bottle that hadn't been there this morning. I didn't know it yet, but the tea Leon was brewing wasn't for comfort. It was the first step in the next stage of my disappearance. I sat at the table, the very table where Jessica had collapsed, and I realized I wasn't just fighting for my land. I was fighting for my life. "Here you go, Dad," Silas said, placing a steaming mug in front of me. "Drink up. It'll help the fog clear." I looked into the dark amber liquid. A tiny, oily film shimmered on the surface. I looked up at my son, the boy I had loved, and saw a stranger with a signature pen waiting in his pocket. "Thanks, son," I said, raising the mug to my lips. I didn't drink a drop. I feigned a coughing fit, spilling the liquid into the napkin I held against my mouth. But the performance was interrupted by a sound from the basement, a heavy, rhythmic thud. Silas froze. His eyes darted toward the basement door. "What was that?" I asked, my voice trembling with genuine fear. "Nothing, Dad," Silas said, his face suddenly slick with sweat. "Just the pipes. You know how this old house is. Just the pipes." But I knew the sound of those pipes. That wasn't plumbing. That was someone or something locked in the dark below us. And as the tea continued to steam between us, I realized that the secret Jessica left on the e-reader was only the beginning. The silence that followed Silas's "just the pipes" excuse was thinner than a sheet of ice on a November puddle. I stared into my mug, watching the oily sheen swirl in the steam. I could feel Leone's eyes on the side of my head, sharp and probing, like she was trying to peer through my skull to see if there was any light left in the room. I played my part. I let my hand shake just a fraction more, causing the ceramic to chatter against my teeth. I didn't know it yet, but that sound in the basement wasn't the plumbing. This house, built by my grandfather in Watngin Chinchumhaimwibon, had pipes made of iron and a foundation of solid basalt. It didn't groan unless someone was forcing it to, but I kept my mouth shut. I let Silas take the mug from my hand, his fingers lingering on mine not out of affection but to gauge my pulse. He thought I was a dying fire, nothing but embers and ash. He didn't realize I was the furnace. To understand how my own son ended up hovering over me like a vulture, you have to understand the Garrison farm. 50 acres of the finest hazelnut soil in the Willamette Valley. My father used to say that if you listened closely enough during the harvest, you could hear the gold clinking in the trees. We weren't rich, but we were rooted. Jessica and I spent 42 years tending those groves. We raised 3 children on the profits of those nuts. But the soil doesn't just grow food. It grows legacies. And legacies are heavy. Silas was always the one who wanted to shed that weight. While his sister Briar was buried in medical textbooks and his younger brother Beckett was lost in the woods, Silas was looking at the horizon. He moved to Portland the day after graduation, traded his work boots for Italian leather, and started a series of consulting firms that always seemed to require a short-term bridge loan from his old man. I gave him the money, every time. I thought I was investing in his future. I didn't realize I was funding his resentment. Then came Leone. 2 years ago, Silas brought her to the farm for Thanksgiving. She looked like a creature made of glass and chrome, completely out of place against the weathered cedar of our porch. She didn't look at the trees. She looked at the topographical maps. She didn't ask about the harvest. She asked about the mineral rights. She was the one who whispered the word fracking into Silas's ear until it sounded like a symphony. "You're sitting on a fortune, Thane," she'd said back then, her voice as smooth as a polished stone. "The valley is changing. Traditional farming is for the sentimental. The real money is in the energy beneath the roots." Jessica had been the one to shut it down. She stood in this very kitchen, her tremors already beginning to show, and told them that as long as she was breathing, not a single drill would touch our soil. I should have seen the look Silas gave her then. It wasn't the look of a son being corrected. It was the look of a man calculating the value of a life against a ledger. The sickness started shortly after that. It was subtle at first, Jessica forgetting where she put her keys, a sudden dizziness while we were walking the North Grove. We called Briar, our daughter, the cardiologist. She was so busy with her practice in Salem, so overwhelmed by her own success, that she trusted Silas's reports. "Dad, Silas says Mom is having episodes," Briar told me over the phone, her voice sounding like a clinical diagnosis. "He's been taking her to a specialist in McMinnville. He says the decline is neurological. We have to be realistic." Silas became the gatekeeper. He was the one who drove her to the appointments. He was the one who picked up the supplements the doctor supposedly prescribed. I remember the day he brought home the first blue bottle. He sat at this table, looking me dead in the eye with a face full of manufactured grief. "The doctor says her vascular system is failing, Dad," he'd said, his hand on my shoulder. "These will help with the blood flow. They're expensive, but Leone found a way to source them through her firm's medical wing. It's the best chance she has." I believed him. I watched my wife, The woman who could outwork a man half her age, turn into a shadow. I watched the blue supplements drain the color from her skin and the light from her eyes. She started complaining about a metallic taste in her mouth. She showed me purple bruises on her arms that appeared out of nowhere. "Tane, I don't feel right," she'd whispered one night in bed, her hand trembling in mine. "When Silas gives me the pills, my head feels like it's full of cotton. I see things in the shadows. I see men in suits walking the orchard at night." I told her it was the illness. I told her the medicine was working, it just took time. I fed her the very poison that was dissolving her from the inside out, and I did it with a smile and a glass of water. That guilt, that's the real weight I carry. It's not the age. It's the knowledge that I was the accomplice to her execution. Now, sitting in the kitchen with Silas and Leon, the house felt like it was closing in on me. Silas stood up and started pacing. He always paced when he was close to a deal. He looked at the stack of mail on the counter bills I'd ignored, tax assessments, and the glossy brochures from Riverside Memory Care that had been appearing like weeds in a garden. "Dad, we need to talk about the situation," Silas said, leaning against the counter. He didn't look at me. He looked at the stove. Leon and I were looking at the books. "The farm is hemorrhaging money. The harvest was down 20% this year because you weren't focused. And with Mom gone, well, it's just too much for one man." "I'm doing fine, Silas," I said, making sure to let my voice quaver. "The trees, they just need a little pruning. I'll get to it in the spring." "There won't be a spring thing," Leonie said, her voice dropping that fake warmth. She pulled a folder from her designer bag. "The state natural gas auction is in 5 days. If we don't have the easement signed and the land title transferred to Silas's management firm by Friday, we lose the window. The drilling company will move to the Miller plot next door, and our equity becomes worthless." "Easement?" I blinked, playing the fool. "But your mother," she said. "No drilling." She said the trees. "Mom isn't here anymore, Dad." Silas snapped, his mask slipping for a second. The rage in his eyes was naked and ugly. He caught himself, taking a breath and softening his tone. "What I mean is, Mom wouldn't want you to suffer. This house is a tomb. Riverside is beautiful. They have gardens, experts, people who can help with your confusion. We've already seen the room. It's got a view of the mountains." "A room," I repeated. "Like a hotel." "Exactly like a hotel," Leon chimed in, sliding a paper across the table. "It was a power of attorney form. We just need your signature here. Just to handle the logistics while you transition. It's for your protection, Thane. So you don't have to worry about the taxes or the men from the energy company." "The men," I said, my heart skipping a beat. "Pete Miller, my neighbor, he said he saw men. In a black SUV. Looking at the North Grove." Silas and Leon exchanged a look. It was quick, a flicker of silent communication, but I caught it. It was the look of two people who realized their confused Mark was still noticing too much. "Pete's 80, Dad. He's more lost than you are," Silas said dismissively. "Now why don't you just sign this? Then we can have dinner. I brought that roast you like." I looked at the pen, a heavy gold-plated thing that Leon had produced. I could feel the USB drive in my pocket pressing against my ribs like a second heart. I knew that if I signed that paper, I was signing my own death warrant. Silas didn't want me in a hotel with a mountain view. He wanted me in a box, 6 feet under the soil he was about to sell. "My hand, it's real stiff today, Silas," I said, clutching my wrist. "Maybe tomorrow, after I sleep. The fog is real thick tonight." Silas's jaw tightened. I saw the muscles in his neck bulge. He wanted to scream. He wanted to grab my hand and force the pen across the page. But Leon touched his arm, a silent command to stay patient. "Of course, Thane," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Tomorrow morning, we'll stay the night in the guest room, just to make sure you're okay. You shouldn't be alone when the spells happen." They stayed. They moved into my house like they already owned it. I retreated to my bedroom, locking the door and sitting in the dark. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want them to see my shadow. I pulled out the e-reader and the headphones Corbin had given me. I skipped to the next file. Firmware update Bonfai Bamui. The sound was clearer this time. It was recorded in the kitchen, likely from the device sitting on the counter while Jessica was napping. I heard the clink of glassware. I heard Leonie's sharp, distinctive laugh. "He's stronger than she was," Leon's voice said on the recording. "The pills are taking longer to dull his cognitive function. We might have to increase the dosage." I can't just dump the whole bottle in his tea, Leon. Silas's voice replied, sounding stressed. Briar is coming down this weekend. If she sees him in a catatonic state, she'll start asking questions. She's a doctor. For God's sake. Then we trigger the agitation protocol, Leonie said, her tone clinical. We make him look dangerous. A few broken plates. A forgotten stove burner. Maybe a threat against us. If he's a danger to himself and others, we don't need his signature. The state will grant you emergency guardianship. We just need the incident to happen before Friday. I felt a cold sweat break across my brow. They weren't just waiting for me to fade. They were going to stage a mental breakdown. They were going to make me the villain in my own home. And the other thing? Silas asked. The stuff from the darknet? It arrived, Leon said. It's in the barn, in the old grain bin. 1 dose in his evening tea, and his heart will look like it just gave out from the stress. No bruises, no trauma. Just an old man who couldn't handle the grief. The recording ended. I sat in the silence of my room, the rhythmic ticking of the bedside clock sounding like a countdown. I looked out the window toward the barn. The old red structure stood like a silhouette against the rising moon. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't wait until Friday. I had to see what was in that grain bin. I waited until I heard the guest room door click shut and the house settle into that uneasy, predatory quiet. I slipped out of my window, a trick I hadn't used since I was 17, and dropped onto the soft mulch of the garden. The rain had turned to a fine mist, clinging to my clothes as I crept toward the barn. My knees ached, and my lungs felt tight, but the adrenaline was a hell of a drug. I reached the barn door, the heavy timber groaning as I slid it open just enough to squeeze through. The smell of hay and old oil greeted me, a comfort that felt out of place in the middle of a murder plot. I found the grain bin in the back corner, tucked behind the antique tractor Jessica had loved. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside, among the dust and the burlap, sat a small, unmarked wooden box. I opened it. It wasn't pills. It was a vial of clear liquid and a set of professional-grade syringes. And next to them, a folded piece of paper. I picked it up, expecting a receipt or instructions. It was a map of the farm, my farm, but it wasn't marked for fracking. It was marked with red X's over the house, the barn, and the wedding tree. And in Leon's sharp, elegant handwriting at the bottom were 4 words that turned my blood to ice. Total liquidation. No survivors. I realized then that Silas wasn't just the tool. He was the next victim. Leonie didn't want a partner. She wanted the whole damn valley, and she was planning to use my death to frame Silas and Silas's suicide, to take the rest. Suddenly, the barn lights flickered on. I spun around, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. Silas was standing in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the mist. He wasn't wearing his expensive leather shoes. He was wearing his old work boots, and in his hand, he held a heavy iron pry bar. I knew you weren't as confused as you looked, Dad, he said, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying kind of sorrow. You always had to dig, didn't you? You just couldn't let it go. He started walking toward me, the pry bar scraping against the concrete floor. What's in the box, Silas? I asked, backing away toward the tractor. Does Leon know you're here? Or are you just the first one she's going to discard? Silas stopped. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, but then it vanished, replaced by a desperate, hollow resolve. She loves me, Dad. We're going to be rich. We're going to be free of this dirt. And you're making it hard. Why do you always have to make it so hard? He lunged. The iron pry bar whistled past my ear, the wind of its passage cold against my skin. It slammed into the side of the Motngin Chinchumnumwe High Massey Ferguson tractor with a bone-jarring clang that echoed through the rafters like a funeral bell. Silas stumbled, the momentum of his rage carrying him forward into the heavy steel. I didn't wait for him to find his footing. I'm 70, and my knees scream when I go downstairs, but in that moment 40 years of hauling hazelnut sacks flooded back into my muscles. I didn't run for the door. Silas was already blocking it. Instead, I ducked behind the towering stacks of empty wooden crates near the grain bin. Silas, stop, I hissed, my voice echoing in the cavernous dark. Look at what's in your hand. Look at who you're swinging at. I'm your father, boy. You're an anchor, Dad. Silas screamed, his voice cracking with a terrifying high-pitched desperation. He swung again, shattering the corner of a cedar crate. Splinters flew like shrapnel. "You're an anchor dragging me down into the mud." We could have had everything. Leon had it all mapped out. The money, the freedom, and you just had to stay lucid. You couldn't just fade away like Mom. The mention of Jessica felt like a physical blow to my gut. I retreated further into the shadows of the barn, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm. I knew every inch of this structure. My grandfather had built it with secret spaces and sturdy lofts, and right now that knowledge was the only weapon I had. I didn't know it yet, but the next 10 minutes would decide if I lived to see the sunrise or became part of the foundation. I remembered Silas as a 5-year-old in this very barn, clutching a wooden toy and hiding from the rain. I had picked him up, tucked him under my coat, and promised him he'd always be safe here. Now that same boy was hunting me with a piece of scrap iron. "Silas, listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded note I'd found in the grain bin. "Leonie isn't your partner. She's your executioner." I found the map. I found the no survivor's note. "She isn't just planning to get rid of me. She's setting you up, son. The suicide dose is right there in that box." Silas paused, the pry bar hanging limp for a second. The dim overhead light caught the sweat on his brow, making him look slick and oily. "You're lying," he whispered, though the conviction was leaking out of his voice. "She loves me. She needs me for the contracts. She needs a fall guy, Silas. Think. Why is the offshore account in your name? Why is the darknet delivery addressed to you? When I turn up dead from a stroke and you're found with the empty vial, who do you think the sheriff is going to arrest?" For a heartbeat, I thought I'd reached him. The silence in the barn was absolute, save for the rhythmic patter of the mist on the tin roof. But then, the barn door creaked open further. Leon stood there, silhouetted against the moonlight, her designer trench coat looking like a shroud. She didn't have a pry bar. She had a small silver handgun. "He's gaslighting you, Silas," she said, her voice as calm and cool as a mountain stream. "He's trying to drive a wedge between us because he's losing his grip. He's the one who's dangerous. Look at him, hiding in the dark like a cornered rat." She stepped into the barn, the click of her heels on the concrete sounding like a ticking clock. Silas looked from her to me, his face a mask of agonizing confusion. He was a weak man, always had been, and Leonie knew exactly how to pull his strings. "Finish it, Silas," she commanded, her eyes fixed on me. "Or I will. And if I have to do it, the deal we made changes. You become a liability instead of a partner." The threat was clear. Silas raised the pry bar again, his knuckles white. I knew I couldn't outrun a bullet or outfight my son, but I had one last trick. Behind the grain bin was a heavy iron ring set into the floor, the entrance to an old Prohibition-era root cellar that my grandfather had used to hide apple brandy from the feds. Most people forgot it was there, covered by decades of dust and debris. As Silas lunged, I didn't move away, I moved down. I yanked the ring with every ounce of strength I had, the heavy oak door swinging upward just as Silas's boots hit the edge. He didn't have time to react. He tumbled forward, his scream cut short as he disappeared into the dark. 6-foot drop. Thud. He hit the dirt floor of the cellar hard. The pry bar clattered away into the darkness. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the door shut and slid the heavy iron bolt home. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would hold Silas. Leon fired. The bullet whistled past my shoulder, burying itself in a support beam with a sharp thwack. I scrambled behind the Massey Ferguson, the smell of old diesel fuel suddenly overwhelming. I didn't have a gun. I didn't have a phone. It was back in the house. I was a 70-year-old farmer in a dark barn with a sociopath who was currently reloading. "You're making this so much harder than it needs to be, Thane," Leon called out, her voice bouncing off the high ceiling. "You could have died in your sleep, dreaming of your trees. Now it's going to be messy. I'll tell the police you went into a dementia-fueled rage, killed Silas, and I had to defend myself. It's a perfect story." I stayed silent, moving through the shadows toward the back of the barn. I knew there was a loose board near the hay chutes, a gap just wide enough for a man who knew how to twist his shoulders. I squeezed through, the rough cedar scratching my chest, and tumbled out into the wet grass of the orchard. I ran. Not toward the house, they'd expect that. I ran toward the wedding tree, the massive white oak that stood at the heart of the farm. I needed time to think. I needed to access the e-reader again. There was something Jessica had mentioned in the recordings, something about a master key for the digital patient logs at Riverside. What happened next changed everything. As I reached the oak, I saw a light flickering in the distance, near the front gate. It wasn't the police. It was a silver SUV I recognized instantly. Briar, my daughter, the cardiologist. She wasn't supposed to be here until the weekend. I stood in the shadows of the orchard, my lungs burning, watching her car pull up to the house. I realized then that Leone had called her. She was bringing in the medical expert to witness my breakdown. If Briar saw me like this, disheveled, covered in barn dust, rambling about murder and hidden root cellars, she wouldn't see a victim. She'd see a patient. I had to get to her first. But as I turned to head back toward the driveway, a hand clamped over my mouth and a strong arm wrapped around my chest, pulling me back into the dark of the trees. "Don't make a sound, Dad," a voice whispered in my ear. It was Beckett, my youngest, the one we all thought was too far gone on the stuff to be of any use. He smelled like wood smoke and old flannel, and his eyes, visible in the moonlight, were sharper than I'd seen them in years. "I've been watching them," Beckett whispered, leading me deeper into the grove. "I saw what they did to Mom's medicine. I saw Silas in the barn tonight. I've got a camp set up in the North Grove. We have to move, now." I followed my son, the screw-up of the family, realizing that while I had been playing the fool, he had been playing the ghost. He led me to a small clearing hidden by overgrown blackberry brambles. There, under a camo tarp, was a laptop and a high-gain antenna pointed toward the farmhouse. "I tapped into the house Wi-Fi a month ago," Beckett said, sitting down and cracking his knuckles. "I saw the brochures for Riverside. I knew Silas was planning something, but I didn't know how deep it went until I heard the recordings Jessica left on that e-reader. She told me to watch the digital logs. Dad, she knew you'd find the device." I stared at my son. "You knew? You've known all this time?" "I couldn't come to you," Beckett said, his voice thick with a heavy, localized grief. "Silas was monitoring your phone. Leone had cameras in the kitchen. If I'd walked in there and told you, they would have sped up the timeline. I had to wait for them to make a move." He turned the laptop screen toward me. It showed a live feed of the kitchen. Leone was standing by the sink, splashing water on her face, breathing hard. She looked disheveled. Her perfect mask finally cracked. Briar was walking through the front door, looking confused and terrified. "They're going to tell her you've lost it," Beckett said. "And they're going to use the incidents Leone staged this afternoon to prove it. Look." He clicked a file on the desktop. It was a series of photos and short video clips taken from hidden cameras I never knew existed, cameras Leone had installed to document my decline. Clip mode. Me standing over the stove with a blank stare recorded while I was actually grieving. Clip high. A pile of broken heirloom china on the floor, which Leone had smashed while I was in the orchard. Clip ba. A forged journal entry, written in a shaky hand that looked just like mine, detailing voices I was hearing in the trees. "They've been building a digital case for your involuntary commitment for weeks," Beckett explained. "Briar isn't here to help you, Dad. She's here to sign the papers." I felt a surge of cold, calculating fury. My own children, one trying to kill me, one trying to lock me away, and one living like a phantom in the woods to protect me. The Garrison family was a house divided, and the foundation was currently on fire. "Can you get into the Riverside logs?" I asked, my voice turning to steel. Jessica said there was proof of bribery. Proof that the head nurse, Linda, is on Leone's payroll. "I'm in," Beckett said, his fingers flying across the keys. "But it's encrypted. I need the master key," Jessica mentioned. "Did she give you a code? A number? Anything?" I thought back to the recordings. Check the stove, Thane. They've already started the next stage. I thought about the wedding tree. I thought about the e-reader. The historical novels, I whispered. The ones she loved. She told me to finish them. There was one she was always reading at the end. The Count of Monte Cristo. "Page and line numbers?" Beckett asked. "No," I said, a memory clicking into place. The bookmark. She made a handmade bookmark with our wedding date on it, but she'd changed the year. I thought it was just her tremor, her confusion. I pulled the e-reader out. I opened the digital bookmark for the book. The date was listed as Saumwi Hai Mutngin Chin Chum Tamwi Bon, but our wedding was in Mutngin Chin Chum Bai Mui Sao. "Try Sao Chio Mutcham Hai Mui Mutngin Chin Chum Tamwi Bon," I said. Beckett typed it in. The screen flickered. And then a cascade of documents began to scroll past. Bank transfers, payouts to a shell company called LM, healthcare consulting, emails between Leon and Nurse Linda discussing the sedation protocol for a difficult asset. "We have it, Dad," Beckett said, a grim smile touching his lips. "We have enough to bury them both." "Not yet," I said, looking at the feed of Briar talking to Leon in the kitchen. Briar was crying now, clutching her medical bag. "If we go in now, Leon will claim the data is hacked, that Beckett's a junkie making up stories. We need her to confess. We need her to say it out loud, on camera, to Briar. How are we going to do that?" I looked at the house, the place where I'd spent my life. "We're going to give them the agitation they want. We're going to give them a performance they'll never forget." I didn't know it yet, but the trap I was about to set would require me to walk right back into the lion's den, with no protection but a hidden microphone and a daughter who thought I was a monster. "Beckett," I said, standing up, "go to the root cellar. Get Silas out. But don't let him see you. Make him think the door failed. He'll head straight for the house to find Leon. That's when we start the clock." I walked back toward the farmhouse, the mist cooling my face. I stepped onto the porch and threw open the front door with a deliberate, violent crash. "Where is she?" I screamed, my voice echoing through the halls, sounding exactly like the broken, dangerous man they wanted me to be. "Where's Jessica? I know you've hidden her in the walls." Briar and Leon spun around in the kitchen. Briar's face went white. Leon, however, gave a small, almost imperceptible smirk. The game was on. But as I saw Silas limping up the porch steps behind me, his face covered in cellar dirt and his eyes wild with a new, murderous intent, I realized I might have overestimated my ability to control the chaos I'd just unleashed. I stood in the center of the kitchen, my chest heaving, my eyes darting from corner to corner like a trapped animal. I grabbed a copper pot from the hanging rack and slammed it against the butcher block island. The clang was deafening, a sharp, violent vibration that made Briar jump back, her hands flying to her mouth. This was the performance of a lifetime, the agitation they'd been praying for. "She's in the cupboards, Briar," I roared, my voice sounding raw and unrecognizable even to me. "I can hear her fingernails scratching at the wood. Why did you let them put her in there?" "Dad, please," Briar sobbed, her clinical distance finally shattering. She looked at me not as a doctor, but as a daughter watching her hero turn into a stranger. "Mom is gone. We had the funeral. You were there. You held my hand." Leon stepped toward her, putting a comforting arm around Briar's shaking shoulders. Her eyes, however, stayed locked on mine. They were cold, calculating, and victorious. She was watching a plan come to fruition, a 50-acre harvest of blood and betrayal. "See, Briar," Leon whispered, her voice a poisonous honey. "This is what I was telling you about. The visual hallucinations, the auditory triggers, the violent outbursts. It's a classic late-stage neurological collapse. He's not safe here. He's a danger to himself. And clearly, he's a danger to the house." I didn't know it yet, but the needle in Briar's medical bag wasn't the only weapon in the room. In Leonie's designer briefcase, sitting right on my kitchen table, was a finalized deed of sale for the Garrison farm, already signed with a perfect forgery of my signature. They weren't just waiting for me to be committed. They had already sold the ground out from under my feet. The front door groaned open, and Silas stumbled into the light of the kitchen. He was a mess. His expensive silk shirt was torn at the shoulder, his face was smeared with the gray silt of the root cellar, and he was limping heavily. He looked like he'd crawled out of a grave. "He tried to kill me," Silas gasped, pointing a shaking finger at me. He collapsed against the door frame, his breath coming in ragged, wet heaves. He lured me into the barn. He pushed me into the cellar and bolted the door. "He's lost it, Briar. He's completely gone." I watched my son lie with a fluency that would have made a devil blush. He didn't mention the pry bar. He didn't mention the no survivor's note. He played the victim, and I saw the last spark of doubt vanish from Briar's eyes. "Is that true, Dad?" Briar asked, her voice trembling. "Did you hurt Silas?" I let out a low, guttural growl and lunged toward the sink, splashing water onto the floor. "The pipes are screaming. They're telling me what he did to the blue bottles. Silas is the one who made the walls talk." "He's escalating," Leon said, her tone urgent. "Briar, you have the authorization. You're his primary medical contact. If you don't sedate him now, we're going to have to call the sheriff, and you know what that means. He'll end up in a state ward, in a cage. Riverside is the only way to keep this dignified. Briar reached into her bag. Her movements were mechanical, driven by a mixture of fear and a desperate, misplaced sense of duty. She pulled out a vial and a syringe. My heart hammered. I knew what was in that vial, a powerful antipsychotic that would turn my brain to mush for the next 12 hours. If I took that shot, I wouldn't be awake when the notary arrived. I wouldn't be awake when they drove me away from my home for the last time. But I also knew Beckett was watching. Hidden in the lining of my cardigan was a tiny, high-sensitivity microphone he'd given me. Every word, every sob, every lie was being recorded and transmitted to his laptop in the orchard. I just needed one thing. I needed Leone to admit the motive. I needed her to stop playing the savior and show the shark. "You want the trees, don't you, Leone?" I mumbled, collapsing into a kitchen chair, letting my head fall into my hands. "You want to cut them down. You want to drink the oil from the ground." Leone laughed, a short, sharp sound that made Briar flinch. "The oil is the only thing of value left in this family, Thane. Your wife died for a bunch of rotting nuts. You want to follow her? Or do you want to sit in a nice, quiet room while the rest of the world moves on?" "Leone, that's enough," Briar said, her voice sharp. She was looking at Leone with a sudden, flickering suspicion. "He's a sick man. Don't talk to him like he's a business rival." "He's an obstacle, Briar," Leone snapped, her patience finally fraying. "Let's be real. You're drowning in debt from that clinic in Salem. Silas is one step away from a bankruptcy that would strip your family name of every cent. This sale is the only thing keeping the Garrison legacy from being a footnote in a local paper. Now give him the shot so we can finish this." Briar froze. She looked at Leone, then at Silas, who was nodding frantically from the doorway. Then she looked at me. For a second, the fog of lies seemed to lift. She saw the bruises on Silas's face, bruises that didn't look like they came from a fall, but from a struggle. "Wait," Briar whispered. "Silas, you said he pushed you, but you have grease on your hands." "Barn grease? From the tractor. I tried to grab the frame when I fell," Silas stammered. "You told me you haven't been in the barn for weeks because it smelled like Dad's dementia," Briar noted, her medical mind finally engaging. She looked at the syringe in her hand, then back at me. "Dad, look at me. Truly look at me. I didn't break character. I couldn't. Not yet." I looked past her, toward the pantry. "Beckett is in the pantry, Briar. He's eating the seeds. He's hiding from the black cars." Leone's face went white. She spun around, looking at the pantry door. Beckett is in rehab in the Cascades. He's been there for a month." "No," I whispered, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face, a smile that should have warned them. "Beckett never left. He's been the ghost in the machine, Leone, and he's been listening to every word." The silence that followed was absolute. Then the house's intercom system, the old Mutngin Chinchambaimu unit. I'd supposedly forgotten how to use crack to life with a burst of static. The blue supplements were just the first phase. "Silas," Leone's voice echoed through the kitchen. A recording from the barn only 10 minutes prior. "One dose in his evening tea, and his heart will look like it just gave out from the stress. No bruises, no trauma, just an old man who couldn't handle the grief." Briar dropped the syringe. It shattered on the tile, the clear liquid pooling like a spilled secret. She turned to Leone, her face a mask of absolute horror. You were going to kill him," Briar gasped. Leone didn't panic. She didn't cry. She slowly reached into her trench coat and pulled out the silver handgun. The click of the safety being disengaged was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. "I told you, Silas," Leone said, her voice devoid of any human emotion. "He's too dangerous to keep around. And now, your sister is a witness. We're going to have to adjust the total liquidation plan." "Leone, no!" Silas screamed, lunging toward her. But he was too slow, his limp dragging him down. Leone pointed the gun at Briar. "Get in the pantry, doctor. Both of you. Silas, get the rope from the mudroom. We're finishing this tonight. The fire is going to happen 4 days early." I sat in the chair, watching my daughter be herded toward the pantry at gunpoint, watching my son crumble into a heap of cowardly tears. I felt the weight of the e-reader in my pocket. I knew that Beckett was already calling the sheriff, but the nearest deputy was 20 minutes away. 20 minutes is a long time to stay alive in a burning house. "You forgot one thing, Leone," I said, my voice no longer shaking, no longer confused. I stood up, my spine straight. The 70-year-old farmer replaced by the man who had fought for this soil for half a century. Leone sneered. "And what's that, you old fossil?" "The black SUV," I said, pointing toward the window. 2 pairs of high-beam headlights cut through the mist, illuminating the kitchen with a blinding, artificial light. The rumble of a heavy engine vibrated through the floorboards. "Those aren't the energy company men, Leone," I said, my voice like cold steel. "And they aren't the sheriff." Leone frowned, her grip on the gun faltering as she glanced toward the window. I didn't know it yet, but the men in that SUV were the one variable she hadn't accounted for. The consultants she'd hired to intimidate the neighbors had decided they wanted a bigger piece of the fracking pie, and they were tired of waiting for her to manage the garrisons. As the back door was kicked open with a force that shattered the frame, I realized that my family's betrayal was only the first layer of the rot. The vultures were here, and they didn't care who was crazy and who was sane. They just wanted the ground. And then the lights in the house went out. In the sudden, absolute darkness, I heard the sound of glass breaking and the heavy, rhythmic tread of boots that didn't belong to my son. "Briar, get down," I screamed. A gunshot flared in the dark, a muzzle flash that illuminated Leone's terrified face for a fraction of a second before the kitchen erupted into a symphony of violence. What happened next changed the garrison legacy forever. The darkness in that kitchen wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical weight, thick with the smell of ozone, old floor wax, and the acrid metallic sting of gunpowder. That first shot had come from Leone, a blind, panicked fire into the shadows, but the silence that followed was far more terrifying. I dropped to the floor, my old joints popping like dry kindling. In 50 years of farming, I'd learned that the earth always tells you what's coming before your eyes do. I pressed my cheek against the cold linoleum and felt the vibration of heavy, rhythmic footsteps moving through the dining room. These weren't the steps of an old man or a city consultant. These were the boots of men who moved with the clinical purpose of a wrecking crew. "Briar," I hissed into the blackness. "Don't move. Stay under the island." "Dad?" Her voice was a ragged, high-pitched thread of terror. She was a doctor who had spent her life in sterile rooms with bright lights, fighting death with scalpels and science. She wasn't prepared for the kind of death that comes through a kicked-in door in the middle of a storm. "Shut up," Leone's voice shrieked from across the room. I heard the frantic click, click, click of her heels as she scrambled toward the hallway. "Silas, get the lights." "Where are the damn lights?" "The breaker." They pulled the main breaker. Silas's voice was a pathetic, blubbering mess. I heard him thud against the refrigerator. "Leone, they're here. They're actually here. You said they were just for leverage. You said they worked for the firm." I didn't know it yet, but the men Leone had hired to encourage the neighbors into selling their mineral rights men she'd euphemistically called the asset management team had realized something she hadn't. They realized that once the garrisons were out of the picture, there was no reason to hand the fracking rights over to a shell company in Portland. They could just take the deed themselves, leave no witnesses, and disappear into the Oregon mist with a multi-million-dollar payout. Leone had invited the devil to dinner, and now he was asking for the house. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, sharp and cold as a needle. It swept across the kitchen, illuminating the shattered pieces of the porcelain vase Jessica had loved, the spilled tea on the floor, and finally Leone. She stood by the pantry, her silver handgun looking like a toy in her shaking hand. The light didn't stop on her. It moved to Silas, who was curled in a fetal position next to the trash can, weeping. "Ms. Ross," a voice rumbled from the dining room. It was deep, calm, and utterly devoid of mercy. "We checked the briefcase. The deed you had Silas forge, it's a nice piece of work, but it doesn't have a notary's seal yet. And the state auction is on Friday. That's a very tight window." "Vance." Leone's voice was a strangled gasp. "What are you doing? I told you to stay at the perimeter. I told you to wait for the signal." The man stepped into the kitchen. In the backwash of his flashlight, I saw a mountain of a man in a tactical jacket. This was Arthur Vance, a former security specialist who Leone had used to intimidate the Miller family next door. He wasn't interested in consulting fees anymore. "The signal changed, Leone," Vance said. He stepped over the broken frame of the back door, his boots crunching on the wood. "We did some digging of our own. That no survivors note you wrote, the one you were going to use to frame Silas. We found it in your car this afternoon. It gave us an idea. Why bother with the middleman? If everyone in this house dies in a tragic fire tonight, and we happen to have a signed emergency transfer to our own entity, well, the energy company isn't going to ask questions, they just want to drill. I felt the blood drain from my face. They weren't just here to kill me. They were here to erase the entire garrison line. I have the money, Silas screamed, suddenly scrambling to his feet, his hands held out in a desperate plea. I have the offshore account. I can give you the codes. Just don't. Please. Don't hurt me. I'm the one who did the blood thinners. I'm the one who made it easy for you. Silas, you idiot. Shut up. Briar screamed from under the island. But it was too late. The confession hung in the air, heavier than the gun smoke. I felt a surge of cold, murderous rage. My son, the boy I'd taught to fish in the creek, was bartering his mother's murder for his own pathetic life. Vance laughed a dry, rattling sound. We already have the codes, Silas. We took your laptop from the SUV while you were inside acting for your father. You really shouldn't use your mother's birthday as a password. It's sentimental. And sentiment is a weakness. Vance raised a suppressed pistol. The red dot of a laser sight danced across Silas's chest, finally settling right over his heart. Wait, I roared. I stood up, stepping into the path of the flashlight. I didn't care about the gun. I didn't care about the confused act anymore. I was 70 years old, and I had lost my wife, my son's soul, and my peace. If I was going to die, I was going to die as the master of this house. Vance, look at me, I commanded. The light shifted to my face, blinding me for a second. I didn't flinch. You think you've got it all figured out? I asked, my voice steady, vibrating with a power I hadn't felt in years. You think a tragic fire covers a house that's currently being broadcast live to a server in Portland? My son Beckett isn't in rehab. He's in the woods, and he's been recording every word you've said for the last 10 minutes. He's already called the state police. They aren't 20 minutes out, Vance. They're 5. It was a lie, a beautiful, desperate gamble. Beckett had the data, but the sheriff's office was notoriously slow in this part of the valley. But Vance didn't know that. He knew Leon was a liar, so he assumed everyone else in this family was just as capable of deception. Vance hesitated. I saw the red dot waver on Silas's chest. He's bluffing, Leonie screamed, lunging toward Vance. He's a senile old man. He doesn't even know what year it is. Is that right, Leon? I asked, reaching into the pocket of my cardigan. I pulled out the e-reader. Even in the dark, the cracked screen caught the light. Jessica didn't just record you. She recorded the meetings you had with the energy company reps at the McMinnville diner. She recorded the bribes you paid to the county clerk. If I die tonight, the dead man's switch on this device triggers. Everything goes to the Attorney General, the FBI, and the local news. You won't just be a murderer. You'll be the most famous face in the Oregon penal system. Vance looked at the e-reader, then at Leon. The trust between thieves is a brittle thing, and I had just hammered a wedge into the center of it. Is that true? Vance growled, his voice turning on Leon. You told me the old woman was just a medical complication. You didn't say she was building a federal case. She wasn't, Leon shrieked. She was a dying woman with a tremor. Thane is lying. Suddenly, the house's intercom, the one Beckett had hacked, cracked to life again. But this time, it wasn't a recording. It was Beckett's live voice, booming through the kitchen with the authority of a ghost. I see you, Arthur, Beckett said, his voice cold and distorted. I see the Chinham in your hand. I see the black SUV with the plates covered in mud. The state police just crossed the Miller Creek Bridge. You have 3 minutes to be gone, or you spend the rest of your life in a cell next to Leon. That was the open loop that broke the tension. Vance didn't care about the fracking rights anymore. He cared about his own skin. He lowered the gun, his eyes darting toward the back door. This deal is scorched, Vance muttered. He looked at Leon with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. You're on your own, Ross. If we get picked up, the first thing I do is tell them where the supplement box is buried. He signaled to his men, and they vanished into the night as quickly as they'd arrived. The sound of the SUV's engine roaring to life and gravel spraying was the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. But the silence that followed was even more dangerous. The power flickered back on. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed, flickering for a second before bathing the kitchen in a sickly, artificial yellow glow. We were all there, the wreckage of the Garrison family. Silas was still on the floor, his face buried in his hands. Briar was slowly crawling out from under the island, her scrubs covered in dust and her eyes wide with a new, terrifying clarity. And Leone was still standing by the pantry, the silver gun still in her hand. She wasn't running. She wasn't begging. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the true depth of her madness. She had lost the money, the land, and her leverage. All she had left was her rage. "You think you're so smart, Thane," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You think you've won because you've got some recordings. You've destroyed this family. Look at them. Look at your son." She gestured to Silas. "He's a murderer. Even if I go down, he goes with me. I'll make sure the world knows he was the one who crushed the pills. I'll make sure Briar loses her medical license for overlooking the symptoms. I'll burn this entire legacy to the ground." "I know," I said softly. I walked toward her, ignoring the gun. "That's the difference between us, Leone. I'm willing to lose the farm to save the truth. You're willing to kill for a piece of paper." "Stop!" Briar screamed. "Dad, don't. She'll fire." Leone raised the gun, pointing it directly at my forehead. Her finger tightened on the trigger. I saw the hammer pull back. I closed my eyes, ready to join Jessica. I had the recordings. Beckett had the truth. The farm was safe. My life was a small price to pay. Click. The sound echoed in the kitchen. Not a bang. A dry, mechanical click. Leone blinked, staring at the gun. She pulled the trigger again. Click. "The safety," I whispered, opening my eyes. "Or maybe Silas was smarter than you thought." I looked at Silas. He was looking up now, a strange, hollow look in his eyes. He held up a small, silver piece of metal, the firing pin from Leone's handgun. "I took it out while you were in the shower this morning, Leone," Silas said, his voice dead and flat. "I knew you were going to try to kill me eventually. I just didn't know it would be tonight." Leone let out a primal scream of frustration and lunged toward the counter, grabbing the heavy cast-iron skillet. But before she could swing, the front door burst open again. This time it was the sheriff. 2 deputies flooded the room, their weapons drawn. "Drop it," hands in the air. Now. The chaos of the next few minutes was a blur of blue lights, shouting, and the cold metal of handcuffs. Leone was tackled to the floor, her designer coat ripped and her face pressed into the linoleum. Silas didn't fight. He just held out his wrists, a look of profound relief on his face. I sat back down at the kitchen table, the weight of the last few hours finally crushing me. Briar came over and sat next to me, her hand gripping mine so hard her knuckles were white. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, the tears finally flowing. "I was so busy being a doctor. I forgot to be a daughter. I should have listened to Mom. I should have listened to you." "It's okay, Briar," I said, though it wasn't. "We're still here." But as the deputies led Silas and Leone toward the patrol cars, the lead investigator, a man named Miller, who had known me for 30 years, stepped into the kitchen. He looked at the e-reader, then at the no survivors note on the table. "Thane," Miller said, his voice heavy. "We've got the conspirators. We've got the recordings. But there's a problem." I felt a new dread pooling in my stomach. "What problem?" "The darknet box," Miller said. "The one Beckett mentioned. The one with the lethal dose." "It's in the barn," I said. "In the grain bin." Miller shook his head. "We just checked the barn, Thane. The grain bin is empty. And the root cellar. The door was bolted from the inside when we got here." I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at the basement door. The door that Silas had claimed was just the pipes. I realized then that there was a third player in this game, someone who had been moving through the shadows of the house while we were all screaming at each other in the kitchen. Someone who now had the lethal dose and a reason to use it. "Where's Beckett?" I asked, my voice a panicked whisper. "We can't find him, Thane," Miller said. "His camp in the woods, it's been burned out. And his laptop, it was smashed to pieces on the trail." What happened next changed the Garrison legacy from a tragedy into a nightmare. I looked at the e-reader on the table and noticed a new notification flashing on the screen. "New recording. Firmware update num." I pressed play. And the voice that came through the speaker wasn't Jessica's. It was Beckett's. But he wasn't talking to me. We who be a time. We who be a time. "I'm sorry, Dad," Beckett whispered on the recording, the sound of wind whipping in the background. "But the truth isn't enough. They have to pay in the same coin they used on Mom. And Silas? Silas was never the one in charge. Look under the floorboards in the study, look at the insurance policy. I didn't know it yet, but the betrayal I'd uncovered was only the branch. The root of the rot was still in the house, and it was currently holding a syringe. The sirens outside were a rhythmic, pulsing scream, painting the white walls of my kitchen in frantic streaks of blue and red. I watched through the window as Silas was shoved into the back of a patrol car. He looked small, his head bowed, the expensive fabric of his life torn and stained with the dirt of the cellar he'd tried to make my tomb. Leon went into the second car, her chin high, her eyes still cold and defiant, as if she were already calculating which judge she could buy or which lawyer could twist the truth until it suited her. I stood in the center of the room, the silence inside the house feeling heavy and artificial now that the screaming had stopped. Detective Miller was barking orders to his deputies, his voice a low rumble in the hallway, but I wasn't listening. I was staring at the e-reader on the table. The screen was still glowing with that final terrifying notification, firmware update num. Beckett's voice, grainy, distorted, and hollow, was still vibrating in my ears. The truth isn't enough. My youngest son, the one we'd all written off as a ghost of his former self, had been playing a much deeper game than I ever imagined. He hadn't just been recording. He'd been excavating the rot that ran through the very foundation of this family. "Thane, you okay?" Miller asked, stepping back into the kitchen. He followed my gaze to the device. "We need to secure that for evidence. And we need to find Beckett. If he's got that box of liquid warfarin, he's in possession of a lethal substance. He could be a danger to himself, or he's not a danger to himself, Miller," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "He's a man who just realized his own brother and sister were measuring his mother's life in dollars." I didn't wait for the detective to respond. I turned and walked toward the study. My legs felt like lead. Every step a reminder of the 70 years I'd spent building a life that was currently being dismantled by the people I'd built it for. The hallway felt longer than usual, the shadows of the portraits on the wall looking like judging eyes. There was me and Jessica on our wedding day. There were the 3 kids in the orchard, their hands stained purple with blackberry juice. I had been so proud of that life. I had been so blind. I reached the study, a room that smelled of old leather, pipe tobacco, and the dust of 1,000 ignored documents. I closed the door, shutting out the blue and red flicker of the sirens. I didn't need a flashlight. I knew every inch of the oak floorboards. I moved the heavy mahogany desk, a piece that had belonged to my father, to the side, my muscles screaming at the effort. Under the spot where the desk usually sat, near the corner of the rug, there was a loose board. Jessica and I had used it years ago to hide the emergency cash and the titles to the farm equipment. I pried it up with a letter opener, the wood groaning in protest. Deep in the dark space beneath the floor, I found a small tin box. It wasn't the cash box I remembered. This one was new, wrapped in the same oilcloth Beckett had used for his laptop in the orchard. I pulled it out, my hands trembling as I flipped the latch. Inside were 3 things that changed the nature of the betrayal from a crime of greed into a masterpiece of cold-blooded cruelty. The first was a life insurance policy for Jessica. I knew about the policy, of course. We'd had it for 30 years. But this wasn't the Hai Chum Namui Kong policy I signed. It was a rider, dated 6 months before her death, increasing the payout to $1 million in the event of an accidental death or medical mishap. And the beneficiary wasn't me, it wasn't Silas. It was a trust fund held in the name of the Salem Cardiology Research Wing, a wing that was headed by my daughter, Briar. My heart stuttered. I felt a cold, oily dread slide down my throat. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the rider. It was a perfect forgery of my own, but the witness signature wasn't Silas's. It was Leonie Ross's. The second item was a series of handwritten letters. They weren't from Silas. They were from Briar, addressed to Leon. They were clinical, detached, and utterly heartless. In them, Briar had provided the exact chemical breakdown of the warfarin dosage Silas should use. She had coached him on the symptoms to report to the medical board so that no one would suspect a homicide. She hadn't just overlooked the signs of Jessica's poisoning, she had been the architect of the protocol. "No," I whispered to the empty room. "Not you, Briar. Not my little girl." But the third item was the one that broke me. It was a small, digital voice recorder. I pressed the play button, expecting another of Jessica's warnings. Instead, it was a recording from the hospital the night Jessica died. I heard the rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor. I heard the hushed whispers of the nurses. And then, I heard Briar's voice, low and urgent. "It's taking too long, Silas," Briar said on the recording. "The lab results are going to come back flagged if she stays on the ventilator for another 48 hours. We have to terminate the support now. If Dad won't sign the DNR, you have to convince him she's in pain. Do it tonight." "I can't, Briar." Silas's voice replied, sounding terrified. "He's already looking at her bruises. He's asking about the blue bottles." "Then tell him it's the Parkinson's," Briar snapped. "He's an old man. He believes whatever we tell him. Just get the signature, or the research grant is gone, and Leone pulls the funding for the clinic. We are all in this together, Silas. Don't go weak on me now." I dropped the recorder. It hit the floorboards with a dull thud, the sound of the beep, beep, beep still echoing in the room. I felt like I was drowning in the soil I'd spent 40 years tending. My eldest son was a murderer. My daughter was the mastermind. And my wife, my Jessica, had died alone in a hospital bed, while her own children haggled over the price of her heartbeat. I sat there on the floor, the tin box in my lap, and I felt a reversal of my soul. The grief was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve that was more dangerous than anything Leone had ever planned. I didn't know it yet, but the dead man's switch wasn't just about the police. It was about a final, permanent harvest. I heard the study door creak open. I didn't look up. I knew the scent of her perfume, the sterile, hospital-grade soap Briar always used. She was standing in the doorway, her scrubs still wrinkled from the night's trauma, her face a mask of false concern. "Dad?" she asked, her voice soft. "Detective Miller is looking for you. They need a statement. And Silas is asking for you." I slowly turned my head, my eyes meeting hers. For the first time, I didn't see the doctor. I didn't see my daughter. I saw the wolf that had been living in my house, wearing a white coat and a stethoscope. "You had a $1 million grant waiting for you, didn't you, Briar?" I asked, my voice as flat as a grave marker. "The Salem Research Wing. Quite the legacy. A lot of lives could be saved with that kind of money. Just had to trade one life to get it." Briar froze. The mask of concern didn't just slip, it disintegrated. Her eyes darted to the tin box in my lap, then to the letters scattered on the floor. The clinical distance she used to protect herself from the world finally failed her. "Dad, I can't explain," she whispered, her hands beginning to shake. "The farm was dying anyway. Silas was going to lose it all to Leone's firm. I wanted to save something. I wanted Mom's death to mean something. It was going to fund research for Parkinson's. It was going to help people like her." "You killed her to save people like her?" I asked, standing up. I felt a power in my limbs that defied my 70 years. "You didn't save anyone, Briar. You just made sure the only person who actually loved you was buried before she could see what you'd become. Silas was the one who did it." Briar suddenly screamed, the sociopathy she shared with Leone finally bubbling to the surface. "He was the one in the kitchen. He was the one who swapped the bottles. I was just the consultant. I never touched the pills." "But you touched the needle tonight, didn't you?" I asked, stepping closer. "The one that shattered on the floor. What was really in that syringe, Briar? Was it an antipsychotic, or was it the second dose of the total liquidation plan?" Briar backed away, her heels catching on the rug. "I didn't. Leone told me you were dangerous. She told me you'd found out, and you were going to kill us all. She was right about one thing," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I have found out." The window in the study shattered. A heavy, cloth-wrapped object flew through the glass, slamming onto the mahogany desk. It was the wooden box from the barn, the one that had contained the lethal dose of warfarin. But the box was empty, and taped to the top was a note in Beckett's frantic, jagged handwriting. "I found the third syringe, Dad. The one Silas hid in the tractor shed. It's not for you. Check the coffee." I looked at the half-full mug of coffee sitting on my desk, the one Briar had brought me only 10 minutes ago, right after the police had led Silas away. Briar's eyes followed mine. She looked at the coffee, then at the empty box on the desk. Her face went a sickly, translucent gray. "I didn't," she stammered, her voice failing. But then we heard it. The sound of a car engine starting, not a patrol car, but my old Ford YourChannelName. I looked out the broken window and saw Beckett behind the wheel. He wasn't running. He was driving toward the North Grove, toward the wedding tree. and in the bed of the truck, tied down with heavy rope, was the black briefcase Leone had left on the kitchen table, the one with the forged deeds and the offshore codes. "Beckett, no!" Breyer screamed, suddenly lunging toward the door. "He's not taking the money to the police, Breyer," I said, grabbing her arm with a grip she couldn't break. "He's taking it to the burn pile. And he's taking the only evidence that links him to the darknet purchase with him. He'll burn it all," Breyer gasped. "The deeds, the money. It's millions, Dad. Millions." "It's dirt, Breyer," I said. "It was always just dirt." What happened next changed the Garrison family from a house of betrayal into a monument of ash. As Beckett's truck disappeared into the mist, a massive explosion rocked the North Grove. A pillar of orange flame shot into the night sky, illuminating the hazelnut trees like skeletal fingers. Beckett hadn't just burned the briefcase. He had used the diesel tanks in the orchard to ensure that nothing, not the deeds, not the money, and not the people who wanted them, would ever touch this soil again. But as I stood by the window, watching the fire, I felt a sharp, burning pain in my chest. Not the pain of a heart attack, the pain of a man who realized that the coffee wasn't the only thing Breyer had been holding. I looked down at my arm. A small, red dot was blooming on the sleeve of my cardigan. A needle prick. Breyer was standing by the door, a second, smaller syringe hidden in the palm of her hand. She looked at me with a mixture of horror and a cold, clinical curiosity. "You should have just signed the papers, Dad," she whispered. "It would have been so much easier." I felt the room begin to spin. The blue and red lights of the siren seemed to stretch into long, distorted ribbons. I collapsed against the desk, my hand clutching the e-reader. "The dead man switch." I managed to gasp. It triggers in 10 minutes, Breyer. Beckett. He didn't just burn the money. He sent the final file." Breyer laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "Beckett is dead, Dad. That explosion. He was in the truck. There are no witnesses left. Just me. And I'm the doctor who's going to report your tragic heart failure." She stepped toward me, ready to finish the job. But she didn't know it yet. The e-reader wasn't just a recording device. Corbin had added one last feature, a localized GPS beacon and a cellular uplink that didn't need Wi-Fi. As my eyes began to close, I saw the screen of the e-reader flash one last time. "Upload complete, recipient, Oregon State Police HQ." And then, I heard the sound of a helicopter. I didn't know it yet, but the reversal was far from over. I was falling into the dark, but I was taking the whole orchard down with me. The floorboards felt like they were vibrating. Or maybe it was just the rhythm of my own heart failing. The medicine Breyer had pumped into my arm was a cold, creeping numbness that started at my shoulder and began to crawl toward my chest. I slumped against the mahogany desk, the wood grain blurring into a sea of dark, turbulent water. I watched Breyer through a haze of silver spots. She was standing over me, adjusting her stethoscope around her neck with a terrifying, clinical poise. "It's a fast-acting paralytic, mixed with a concentrated potassium chloride." "Dad," she whispered, her voice sounding like it was coming from the end of a long, dark tunnel. "It'll look like your heart just couldn't handle the shock of Silas's arrest. A tragic end to a tragic night. I'll be the first one to call it. My medical license is a shield, remember? No one autopsies a 70-year-old with a documented agitation and a history of heart issues when his cardiologist daughter is right there to sign the death certificate." I tried to speak, but my tongue felt like a lead weight in my mouth. I wanted to tell her about the e-reader, about the signal, about the fact that she was standing in a house that was no longer hers. But all that came out was a wet, rattling gasp. I hit rock bottom in that moment. It wasn't the fear of dying. I'd lived 70 good years, and I missed Jessica more than I could put into words. It was the realization that I had failed as a father. I had raised a monster in a white coat. I had looked at her my whole life and seen the little girl who cried over a broken bird's wing, never realizing she was just practicing how to hold a corpse. "You're wondering about Beckett, aren't you?" Breyer asked, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. She walked to the window, watching the orange glow of the fire in the North Grove. "He was always the weak link, the junkie, the ghost. I knew he was in the woods, Dad. I saw his camp days ago. I let him think he was winning. I let him take the briefcase. I even helped him steal the diesel. He thought he was burning the evidence of his own crimes to protect you. He didn't realize he was just building his own funeral pyre." I felt a tear slide down my cheek, but I couldn't even blink it away. The paralysis was settling in, a cold shroud being pulled over my life. "He's not in the truck, Briar." The voice didn't come from me. It came from the shadows behind the desk. Briar spun around, her eyes widening as the study door swung open, not from the hallway, but from the hidden passage behind the bookshelves that led to the basement. Beckett stepped into the light. He was covered in soot, his clothes singed and smelling of diesel, but his eyes were like two burning coals. He wasn't the shaking addict she'd tried to frame. He was a Garrison, and he was holding the very thing she'd been looking for, the digital recorder from the tin box. "I didn't know it yet," Beckett said, his voice steady and lethal. "But I knew you'd try to kill him the second Silas was gone. You were always the smartest one, Briar. That was your biggest mistake. You thought everyone else was too stupid to see your moves." "Beckett," Briar gasped, her hand flying to her pocket, reaching for the empty syringe. "How?" "I saw the explosion. The truck, remote starter and a bag of fertilizer," Beckett said, stepping toward her. "I've been watching you through the window for the last 10 minutes. I heard everything. And so did the men in that helicopter." As if on cue, a spotlight blinding, white and hotter than the sun slammed through the broken window, pinning Briar against the bookshelves. The roar of the rotors was deafening now, shaking the glass and rattling the very bones of the farmhouse. "This is the Oregon State Police," a voice boomed from the sky. "Drop the weapon. Hands in the air. We have a medical team on approach." Briar looked at the sky, then at Beckett, then at me. Her face went through a dozen different transformations in 5 seconds: fear, rage, calculation, and finally, an ugly, jagged desperation. She realized the dead man's switch hadn't just sent an audio file. Corbin, the technician, had been far more clever than I'd realized. He had turned the e-reader's front-facing camera into a live stream the moment I entered the study. The state police hadn't just heard her confession. They had watched her inject me. "Dad, I can reverse it," Briar suddenly screamed, lunging toward her medical bag. "I have the antidote. I can save you. Tell them it was an accident. Tell them we were just practicing a procedure. Stay away from him," Beckett roared, shoving her back. He knelt beside me, his hands shaking as he gripped my shoulders. "Hold on, Dad. The paramedics are coming. They're landing in the north pasture. Just stay with me. Look at the trees. Remember what Mom said. Look at the trees." I looked past him. Through the broken window, I saw the hazelnut groves, illuminated by the flashing lights and the fire. And for a second, I saw her, Jessica. She was standing at the edge of the woods, her white dress catching the wind, a look of profound peace on her face. She wasn't a ghost of a victim. She was the one who had led us here. She was the architect of the final harvest. I felt a sudden, sharp prick in my other arm. Beckett wasn't waiting for the paramedics. He'd found the reversal agent in Briar's bag, a vial labeled with her own clinical shorthand. He'd watched her use it on patients 100 times. He slammed the plunger down, and for a second, my heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. The numbness didn't fade. It was ripped away by a surge of fire. I gasped, my lungs suddenly expanding with a violent, agonizing breath. I sat up, coughing, the gray fog lifting from my eyes. Briar was on her knees now, being handcuffed by a tactical officer who had rappelled from the helicopter. She was screaming about her career, about the research wing, about how she was the only one who could save the Garrison name. She looked like a rabid animal. Her clinical mask shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You're not a Garrison anymore, Briar," I whispered, my voice sounding like a ghost's. "You're just another vulture, and the ground is done with you." As they dragged her out, the lead investigator, the same man who had taken Silas, stepped into the room. He looked at the chaos, the empty vials, and the soot-covered Beckett. He looked at me, sitting on the floor of my father's study, holding an e-reader that had just dismantled my entire life. "Thane," the investigator said, his voice soft, "we've got the full recording. We've got the physical evidence from the basement, and we found the third package Silas was hiding." "What package?" I asked, my heart still hammering against my ribs. The investigator held up a small, sealed envelope. It had been hidden in the insulation of the cellar. It was addressed to the State Natural Gas Commission. I opened it with a shaking hand. Inside was a document I never expected to see. It was a secret deed, signed by Silas, Leone, and Briar, selling the farm to a foreign energy conglomerate for a lump sum of high million to be paid out only upon the confirmed passing of the primary title holder. They hadn't just been planning to commit me. They had a literal bounty on my head. But then I saw the date on the document. October Murbonth. That was yesterday, I said. They signed this yesterday. Check the last page, Thane, the investigator said. I flipped to the back. There, in the witness section, was a signature that made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't Arthur Vance. It wasn't a notary. It was Jessica Garrison. The date of her signature was listed as yesterday, but Jessica had been in the ground for 2 months. I looked at Beckett. He was staring at the paper, his face going deathly pale. We both realized the same terrifying truth at the same time. If Jessica's signature was on a document from yesterday, then the woman we'd buried in the family plot wasn't the only one Silas had been managing. What happened next changed the Garrison revenge story from a family tragedy into a hunt for a truth that was far more sinister than a simple murder. Beckett, I whispered, my voice trembling with a new kind of fear. If Mom's signature is on this, then who did we actually exhume from that grave? Beckett didn't answer. He just looked at the basement door, the one that had been bolted from the inside, the one where I had heard the pipes screaming. I didn't know it yet, but the revenge plan wasn't over. It was just shifting into its final, most lethal phase. My wife wasn't just a recording on an e-reader. She was a ghost who was still walking the halls of this house, and she was waiting for me to finish the harvest. I stood up, grabbing the heavy iron pry bar Silas had dropped. Open the basement, Miller, I commanded. We're going to find out who's really living in this house. The door didn't just open. It was shattered by a force from the other side. And as the darkness of the cellar rushed up to meet us, I realized that the ultimate betrayal was one I never could have imagined in my wildest dreams. The heavy oak door to the root cellar didn't just open. It splintered under the force of a battering ram brought in by the state police. I stood behind Detective Miller, the iron pry bar heavy in my hands, my heart a frantic, uneven drum against my ribs. As the wood gave way, a rush of cold, stagnant air thick with the scent of damp earth, rubbing alcohol, and something sweet and cloying surged up into the hallway. The beam of Miller's tactical light cut through the gloom of the basement, dancing over the rows of dusty preserves and the rusted farm tools. But as we moved past the wine racks, toward the back wall, where the sound of the pipes had been most frequent, the light hit something that didn't belong in an Oregon farmhouse. A false wall of heavy cedar had been constructed behind the old boiler. It was professional work, soundproofed with the same high-density foam used in recording studios. Miller gestured for his men to stand back. He didn't use the ram this time. He found the electronic keypad hidden behind a loose brick. The code, Thane, Miller whispered, looking at me. Think. What would Silas use? I didn't have to think. I looked at the keypad and typed in the numbers from the forged life insurance rider. Samwe Haimot Nginchin Chamthamwe Bon. The date of the new legacy. The lock clicked with a heavy, mechanical finality. The door swung open. The room inside was small, sterile, and lit by a single flickering fluorescent bulb. It looked like a high-end hospice ward transplanted into a dungeon. There was a bed, a heart monitor, and a small table covered in vials of clear liquid, the same liquid I'd seen in the dark net box. And in that bed, propped up by pillows and hooked to a silent IV drip, was Jessica. I felt my knees give way. I hit the concrete floor, the pry bar clattering away. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I had spent 2 months mourning a woman who was currently staring at me with wide, hollow eyes that were clouded by a thick chemical fog but were undeniably hers. Jessica, I managed to choke out, my voice a broken rasp. She didn't answer with words. Her hand, thin and translucent as parchment, moved toward the edge of the bed. Her fingers were twitching, a rhythmic tapping against the metal rail. Tap, 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 tap. The sound of the pipes. It wasn't plumbing. It was a woman using the only strength she had left to tell the man above her that she was still there. She's alive, Beckett whispered from behind me, his voice full of a jagged, agonizing wonder. They didn't kill her, they stored her. Miller was on his radio, his voice frantic as he called for a trauma team and a forensic specialist. But I wasn't listening. I crawled to the side of the bed and took her hand. It was cold, so cold, but I felt a faint, fluttering pulse against my thumb. I'm here, Jess, I sobbed, burying my face in the scratchy wool of the hospital blanket they'd wrapped her in. I'm here. I've got you. The truth came out in the following hours, a narrative of such absolute depravity that it made the initial murder plot look like a kindness. Briar and Silas hadn't just wanted the money. They needed the validity. To sell the farm to a foreign conglomerate, they needed the primary title holder, Jessica, to be legally alive and capable of signing documents until the final wire transfer was completed. The woman we had buried in the Garrison family plot 2 months ago was a Jane Doe, a terminal patient from Briar's clinic in Salem who had died of natural causes with no next of kin. Briar had used her position as a department head to switch the bodies, staging the stroke at the farmhouse with a look-alike, while the real Jessica was smuggled into the basement in a laundry crate. For 60 days my own children had lived above their mother's prison. They had eaten dinner, laughed, and plotted my own demise while she was kept in a state of medically induced compliance just 20 feet beneath their feet. Every time I had heard a thump in the night, every time I thought I smelled her lavender perfume in the hallway, it wasn't my grief playing tricks on me. It was the reality of her proximity. Leon had been the broker, Silas had been the jailer, and Briar had been the doctor, maintaining the delicate balance of the warfarin and sedatives to ensure Jessica stayed alive long enough to sign the deeds, but too drugged to ever scream for help. The recordings on the e-reader hadn't been a warning from beyond the grave. Jessica had recorded them during the brief windows when the drugs wore off, using a device Beckett had smuggled to her weeks ago through the laundry chute. She wasn't just leaving a trail, she was fighting her way back to the surface. I sat in the waiting room of the Portland OHSU hospital 3 days later. The air smelled of sterile air and hope, a combination that felt foreign to me. Beckett was asleep in the chair next to me, his face finally clean of the soot and the shame. Alaric Benedict walked through the double doors, his briefcase heavy with the finality of the law. He sat down and handed me a single sheet of paper. "It's over, Thane," Alaric said. "The foreign conglomerate has pulled out. The deeds are null and void. The state has seized every asset Leon Ross ever touched. And the Jane Doe in the cemetery, she's been properly identified and moved to a dignified rest." "And my children?" I asked. Alaric looked at the floor. "The prosecutor is pursuing kidnapping with intent to commit fraud and desecration of a human remains, on top of the conspiracy and attempted murder charges. Because they used medical facilities to facilitate the kidnapping, the federal government is involved now. Silas, Briar, and Leon. They won't just be in prison. They'll be in the kind of places where the sun only shines through a slit in the door. They'll never see this valley again." I nodded, feeling a strange, hollow peace. Justice was a harvest, but it was a bitter one. I had saved the farm, and I had saved my wife, but I had lost the family I thought I knew. "Can I see her?" I asked. The doctor led me into the intensive care unit. The room was bright, filled with the sounds of machines that were finally helping her instead of hurting her. Jessica was awake. The chemical fog had begun to lift, and though her voice was still a mere thread, her eyes were sharp. They were the eyes of the woman who had planted 1,000 trees and faced down the coldest winters. I sat by her bed and held her hand. She looked at me, a small, crooked smile touching her lips. "Thane," she whispered, the word barely a breath. "I'm here, Jess." The trees," she said, her fingers tightening on mine. "Are they okay?" "They're fine, honey," I said, the tears finally coming without the sting of salt. "Beckett and we're taking care of them. The harvest is going to be the biggest one yet." She closed her eyes, a look of profound relief washing over her. She had won. She had been the ghost in the machine, the prisoner in the cellar, and the master of the long game. She had trusted that the man she'd loved for 40 years would be smart enough to find her, and she had been right. The moral of the Garrison story isn't about the money, and it isn't even about the revenge. It's about the soil. You see, a family is like an orchard. You can spend your whole life tending the branches, pruning the leaves, and praying for rain. But if the roots are rotted, if the very foundation is built on greed instead of truth, the whole thing will eventually come crashing down, no matter how much gold is clinking in the trees. I returned to the farm a month later, pushing Jessica's wheelchair onto the porch. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and the promise of snow. Beckett was in the North Grove, his silhouette moving rhythmically as he cleared the last of the debris from the fire. The Garrison farm is a sanctuary now. No drills will ever touch this ground. No companies will ever buy our silence. We are a family of ghosts and survivors, rooted in the truth and guarded by the memories of the woman who refused to stay buried. I looked out over the valley. the orange sun dipping below the horizon, and I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the prison cells or the frozen bank accounts. It was the fact that we were still here. We were still breathing, and the hazelnuts were still growing. Some people call it a story of betrayal. I call it a story of a long overdue harvest. And as the wind moved through the leaves, I didn't hear the pipes screaming anymore. I just heard the land, finally at peace. Thank you for following the story of the Garrison family. Their journey through the darkest corners of betrayal and back into the light serves as a powerful reminder that even the deepest secrets eventually find their way to the surface. If you found Thane's resilience and Jessica's strength inspiring, please consider sharing this story. What part of this final reversal shocked you the most? Could you ever find it in your heart to forgive children who had crossed such a line? Let's discuss it in the comments below. Stay grounded, stay watchful, and remember the truth is the only thing that truly grows.